Proposition 30 provides funding for programs to reduce air pollution and prevent wildfires by increasing tax on personal income over $2 million. This is an initiative statute, meaning that petitions were sent around and enough signatures were signed to go ahead and put it on the ballot. A yes vote on Proposition 30 means that taxpayers with a personal income above $2 million annually would pay an additional 1.75% tax on income above $2 million. The revenue collected from the tax would support zero-emission vehicle programs and wildfire response and prevention activities. A no vote means that there would be no changes made to the taxes on personal incomes above $2 million annually, and also the additional revenue for wildfire response and prevention activities wouldn't be available. The state has goals to limit greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change, and to help meet these goals, the state has programs that promote the use of zero-emission vehicles. The state requires ride-sharing companies, for example, like Uber and Lyft, to use an increasing number of zero-emission vehicles for the services that they provide. The state also provides funding to help households, businesses, and governmental agencies buy new zero-emission vehicles, and also to provide funding to install fueling infrastructure such as charging stations for electrical vehicles. On the wildfire response and prevention side, wildfire response activities help limit the spread of large wildfires and stop them from damaging communities and harming residents. The state runs wildfire prevention programs to reduce the chances that wildfires will start, but also to limit the damage they cause when they do occur. If Proposition 30 passes, and beginning in January of 2023, taxpayers with incomes above $2 million each year will pay an additional tax of 1.75% on the share of their income above $2 million. The additional tax would end in 2043 or sooner if the greenhouse emissions are reduced below certain levels. So the state has a target for how much it wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so according to the proposition, if the state gets to that target sooner, the tax would end. Proposition 30 requires that the revenue from the new tax go to increasing funding for zero-emission programs and wildfire activities, but here's the distribution of it. About 80% of the total revenue is for two zero-emission program categories. Most of the money will be used to help households, businesses, and governmental agencies pay for part of the cost of transitioning to new passenger zero-emission vehicles. Some of the money would be used to install and operate zero-emission vehicles charging and fueling stations at places such as apartment buildings, single-family homes, and also public locations. For each category that I just mentioned, at least half the money has to be spent on projects that benefit people who live in or near heavily polluted areas and or in or near low-income communities, which are oftentimes also some of the more polluted areas. About 20% of the revenue would be spent on wildfire response and prevention activities, but in general, the state would have to prioritize the spending to hire, train, and retain state firefighters. In terms of the fiscal effect, according to the Legislative Analyst's Office, the new tax would raise about $3.5 to $5 billion annually, depending on what's going on in the economy. Now, one of the challenges, the effect of the proposition on the number of zero-emission vehicles, though, is uncertain. Part of the reason that that's the case is while the legislative analyst was doing their analysis of Proposition 30, the governor and the state legislature were considering adopting what's called the zero-emission vehicle mandate. Well, what happened is as they were working on this analysis, the state passed the zero-emission vehicle mandate in August, and that increases the share of zero-emission vehicles in future years until 2035, at which point car dealers would only be able to sell zero-emission vehicles. So the state legislature passed this while the Legislative Analyst's Office was working on their analysis of this proposition. So ultimately, what the legislative analyst said was that the main effect of the proposition, if it passed, because the transition is going to be made to zero emission vehicles regardless, the main effect of the proposition would be to shift the cost of the transition to zero emission vehicles to the new tax on high income payers instead of vehicle sellers and buyers absorbing the cost of that transition. Here's the argument in favor of Proposition 30. Climate change is fueling extreme heat, prolonged droughts, and catastrophic wildfires that are taking lives, destroying homes, and costing California economy tens of billions of dollars. Also, the air quality in California is the worst in the country. We have to act urgently to reduce the top two sources of air pollution in California, greenhouse gases and greenhouse gases in California, and that's wildfires and vehicles are the two main top sources. Proposition 30 provides funding to prevent and fight wildfires and also to give customers rebates to help pay for zero-emission vehicles to create a statewide network for affordable, convenient charging stations. Proposition 30 does this and is funded by this increase, this 1.7% tax increase on roughly around 35,000 Californians who make more than $2 million annually. The wealthiest top 2% will be the ones who would be impacted by this tax. Small business revenues are not taxed in Proposition 30. It also provides direct rebates and financial assistance to make sure that low-income and middle-income families who want an electric vehicle can afford to buy one. And there is strict accountability in regards to the revenue raised by Proposition 30. The argument in opposition to Proposition 30 goes as follows. The proposition would add up to 3 million new zero-emission vehicles in California over the next 10 years, which means the state would need to increase the capacity of the current electricity grid to handle this massive increase. The expense is not included in Proposition 30 and could wind up being paid by regular utility taxpayers because something would have to pay for it. Our electricity grid is already at the limit in the summer months, and Proposition 30 will increase demand, so the risk of rolling blackouts will become even worse. The state has already adopted a spending plan to ensure the rapid adoption of zero-emission vehicles, that's the zero-emission vehicles mandate, without raising taxes and without threatening the stability of the electrical grid. The state has already budgeted $10 billion to achieve these goals. So if more funding is needed, the state's budget surplus can be tapped, and the surplus can also be tapped for any additional funding to fight wildfires and wildfire prevention. Lastly, and interestingly, Governor the Newsom administration believes these funding infusions, along with regulations associated with the zero-emission mandate, will by themselves bring down zero-emission vehicle prices to match internal combustion engine vehicles themselves. So, in their opinion, it isn't needed. So, Proposition 30. A yes vote means that taxpayers there will be people who make over $2 million annually would pay an additional 1.75% tax on income above $2 million. The revenue collected from the tax would support zero-emission vehicle programs and wildfire response and prevention activities. A no vote means that there would be no changes to the taxes on personal incomes above $2 million annually, and these additional expenses on wildfire response and prevention activities wouldn't be funded. In regards to the organizations that I have included in my chart, the California Republican Party recommends a no vote. The California Democratic Party recommends a yes vote. The Chamber of Commerce recommends a no vote. And both the Los Angeles Times and the Daily News recommend a no vote as well. And as I pointed out in other videos, this is interesting because the editorial board of the Los Angeles Times tends to be more liberal. The editorial board of the Daily News tends to be more conservative, and yet in this case, there's an agreement.